With us the former SNP Cabinet Secretary Alex Neil, the writer and former SNP MSP Joan McAlpine, and the columnist and political commentator Brian Taylor. Thanks all for joining us. Now, Alex, you knew Alex Salmond for what, about 40 years?
Yeah.
You've probably fallen in and out with him over that period, but you served in his cabinet. So how have you been remembering him over the last few days?
Well, first of all, with great sadness, because this is not just a loss for the independence movement, it's a loss for Scotland and indeed for British politics because of what Alec brought, the dimension he brought. And it's no accident that he was overseas when this happened, because he was a great internationalist as well. I was thinking the other day, or last night, about how he handled the cabinet. I've compared Alec to running in the government the way a conductor would run an orchestra. He conducted the orchestra, and then if anyone was out of tune, they either had to get straight back in tune or not be playing in the orchestra at all. He was a very good manager without trying to do everybody else's job. He didn't interfere with you. He let you go on with it, and he expected you to know what you had to do. And I remember one cabinet in particular, when the issue was whether or not to set up an inquiry into child abuse in Scotland. And Alec started the conversation by saying that he believed that we should not have a child abuse inquiry similar to the one down south. And he then went round the cabinet table. I was one of the ones who said, I don't agree, I think we've got to probably have our own inquiry. And a number of others took the same view as me, but the majority of the cabinet agreed with Alec. And at the end of it, when he'd gone round the cabinet table, he then said, actually, I agree with those who actually want an inquiry. I just wanted to find out who's going to tell me what they really think, and those who just tell me what they think I want to hear. And that was the kind of man he is. I mean, I in my department, I remember housing was my first job, and I remember fairly junior officials telling me, the First Minister stopped me today and asked me how I'm getting on with you and how well you're doing. And he was in touch with everything that went on, but and could sense when things were going wrong. And of course that was deliberate, because he stepped in to stop things going wrong unnecessarily.
But he was also a tough taskmaster. And Joan, you were Parliamentary Liaison Officer to Alex Salmond when he was First Minister. Now that's quite close, but it's behind the scenes. So what are you thinking of it just now?
Well, Alec just reminded me of a story that he told me. I used to help with the briefings for First Minister's questions, and there was a young male civil servant round the table once, and he said, see that guy? He said, he was in a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about something that Alec knew a lot about, which I think was energy. And this young man had said, actually, First Minister, I think you're wrong there. I think if you check the figures, and he was from a different department, and the next day Alex said to his private office, I want that guy in my team, because he had actually spoken up
He'd actually been willing
Alec.
to challenge him, because he wanted that.
He wanted, and I think Jeff Aberdeen, as Chief of Staff, said that the other day. He wanted challenged. People talk about his temper, but actually he just loved a good debate.
Brian, you've probably known Alex Salmond over the years, longer than any of the rest of us, from his university days in St Andrews.
Yeah, university together, when he used to stoat about in with long hair and what I was cheeky enough to call a Maoist cap. But at the time I was wearing a cloak and a fedora, so who am I to talk? So I know
absolutely no one at all.
The pictures have been suppressed, Colin. Don't even try. But I mean, people sometimes describe Alex Salmond as a divisive figure, and I think that's primarily supporters of the Union who feared his powerful advocacy on the cause of nationalism, because he was a very powerful advocate for the cause of nationalism. But he made two distinctions. He was a cultural nationalist and a social nationalist, but he played that side down because he said there were plenty advocating that course, and so he advocated the business, economic, and, if you like, populist arguments for independence. At the same time, he also, I remember a phrase he used, he said it's not enough to choose Scotland. He said that's a given for a nationalist. You have to make a choice within Scotland. And so he drove the SNP down the road of being a moderate, and I stress moderate left of centre social democratic pitch to counter Labour's hegemony in the Central Belt, and thereby leading to his victories in 2007 and 11.
But there were some divisions within the SNP. Alex, I don't think you backed him in 1990 when he first went to the leadership, did you?
No, because I felt actually, I mean, he was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and he was regularly on the television as the oil economist for the Royal Bank of Scotland. He was a huge asset to the SNP, and of course he was deputy leader. But I felt that Margaret Ewing's experience at the time perhaps was what we needed at that particular time, knowing full well that Alec would be the next leader after that. But, you know, he ran such a brilliant campaign, and he won overwhelmingly. I think he got 2/3 of the vote. But he didn't create any fissure with Margaret Ewing or anyone else. No, you know, he brought everybody into the team as much as he could. But I'll tell you one thing about Alex Salmond. And, you know, there were some things. For example, I said to him in the 1999 first election to the Scottish Parliament, I didn't think it was politically the right thing to do to promise the penny for Scotland. But he listened to what you were saying. He might, you know, be very argumentative about it, and 50% of the time he changed his mind. You could persuade him because, as Joan said, he liked a good argument. He liked to go through things rigorously. He didn't just sign off things without asking questions. I mean, the ferries thing, the ferries crisis would never have happened under Alex Salmond.
Joan, I mean, the thing is, you won't really have known him quite as well in those days. You would have known him as a journalist in those days. What did you think of him the first time around and before he became First Minister?
I thought he was very impressive. I met him in Babbitt's with his wife Moira in 1990 when he was running for the leadership, and he was looking for support, and he was incredibly impressive. But before that, as someone who supported the cause of independence, watching him on television, he seemed a completely fresh new voice for young people of my generation who perhaps thought the SNP they used to be called the Tartan Tories, and here was this incredibly sharp left of centre guy making these practical arguments about economics, and it was like, this is a fresh new face.
And you know, when he came back to the leadership the second time around, one thing I remember was the first thing I remember of that time was that he actually had to ask his wife for permission to stand for the leadership again. It was so important to him. But what changed about the leadership the second time, Brian?
I think that in the first period his heart really wasn't in it. It was a very difficult election campaign for the SNP.
In the Parliament, in the Scottish Parliament.
In the Scottish Parliament in 1999. By the time he came back, if you remember, he refused. He said he wasn't going to take the leadership again. I believe he only came back because he thought the result was perhaps going in a direction that he wouldn't have found particularly amicable for the party. And so he came in with a rather unexpected partnership of Nicola Sturgeon, unexpected to her, I think that is, as a joint leadership. But he said that he was only going to come back with the opportunity of being First Minister. It didn't seem very likely at the time, but they won by a single seat, and I recall the hub at the top of the Royal Mile standing. I was only a few yards away from covering it for the BBC, and he said, I had a rumour, I think we won the election. But the most amazing one was 4 years later, against a voting system that was explicitly designed to prevent a party, frankly the SNP, from winning majority power with a minority of the popular vote, and yet he still managed to achieve that and therefore brought about the referendum. But of course he had a terrific success in being First Minister and then majority. He brought about that referendum, he negotiated the terms of the referendum, he conducted a powerful campaign, but he fell short. So you have success and failure pretty much in the same voice.
And you worked with him behind the scenes. What was the key to that success? Well, briefly.
Force of personality, and my most vivid memories are being part of the team around him during that campaign. And it was re-elect Alex Salmond as First Minister, and the people that he managed to gather to back him. David Murray, who owned Rangers at the time, actually backed Alex Salmond. Would never have backed the SNP or independence, but he backed Alex Salmond, and he built this incredible consensus. We called it the big bothy, like the big tent, that he would reach out to all of Scotland and bring them in. And I think Scotland walked taller when Alex Salmond became First Minister. He used to say, I do have a grand conceit of myself, but he believed in himself and he believed in Scotland, and I think that he he put the Scottish cringe to bed when he became First Minister.
But it hasn't all been plain sailing.
Yeah.
I'm jumping ahead now, Brian.
Yeah.
You did the interview with him, as did I, at the Champagny Inn after the allegations of sexual misconduct, when he admitted that he was no angel.
Yeah, he said to me he was no angel. He said he had flaws, but he was adamant that he'd not committed anything that was remotely close to a crime. I think when we talk about divisions, let's make one division. Let's make a distinction between the latter period, as it now tragically is, in my sympathy to Maura and the family, with that latter period where they had there are decisions that are still seen, they are still disputed. You know, was he right to set up a new party? He believes it was cooperative to the movement. The SNP leadership frankly saw it as divisive and unhelpful. Was he behaving responsibly towards colleagues and particularly towards women, or was it, as he suspected, an orchestrated campaign against him? Those questions are still there and they're still disputed, but the overall legacy is not disputed. It's the legacy of someone who won 2 elections to the Scottish Parliament, who brought about a referendum, took Scotland to the verge of independence, and is frankly seen as a giant within Scottish politics, whatever the disputatious nature of the view of that latter period.
Alex, facts are chills that win a ding. The facts that Brian's talking about stand, don't they? But there was still that problem over the last few years, which seems to have, for so many people, tarnished his memory.
Well, I think the tragedy is that he was starting to overcome that, actually. He was back in the fray. And if you go back to the reason for setting up Alba, it was a logical thing. It wasn't a personal ego trip or anything like that. And the objective of Alba, I'm in the SNP, I'm not in Alba, so I don't speak as somebody who's prejudiced in favour of Alba. But the logic behind it was, in the post-referendum situation, to be able to move the independence agenda forward, we should try to get a supermajority in the Scottish Parliament. Because if we had a supermajority, particularly if you could get up to about 86 members, 2/3 of the Parliament, then and the Parliament was controlled, if you like, by the pro-independence people to that extent. Although it may be some time before you would get another referendum, if that's the right way to do it the next time rather than an election. The point is, the Parliament would have been super powerful, a supermajority.
That's not what you're thinking about 2026, though. You're not thinking that's likely.
No, I'm not saying
now.
that, but if you go back to the reason why Alex, because he discussed it with me, and that was his logic behind it, and his logic was right.
I'm going to move on away from the politics a wee bit, to the cultural side of Alex Salmond, because he really did have that. I mean, he thought of himself as having been a boy soprano. He really fancied himself as a singer, didn't he? And here he is with Anne Lauren Gillis.
Oh my goodness.
Thou lie be dear to me, entwined thou art with many ties, O hame and infancy.
He did fancy himself as a bit of a singer. He also fancied himself as a bit of a wit and rack on tour, though, didn't he?
Yeah. Well, he was a boy soprano. He was very proud of that. When he opened my parliamentary office in Dumfries in 2012, I arranged for the local community choir to greet him as he arrived in Dumfries High Street. But instead of listening to what they were singing, he joined in. But he also invited them. He said, "You were fantastic. We'll have you up in Edinburgh," and he stood by his word, and they sang at a really big awards ceremony in Edinburgh Castle, which is a memory that none of them will forget.
But he was also quite funny. He did a great I Am Jolly impersonation. He was often in Have I Got News for You, Brian?
He was extremely funny. He actually did a speech at the centenary of the great and mighty Dundee United, and it went down an absolute bomb. But look, the singing there, I'm a bit guilty of that myself, occasionally singing in public. And like Alec, even the pleading of concerned friends can't stop us when we're determined to sing. That's a lot better than I remember it. I've got to say. Hey, I'll give you the road and the miles to Dundee, and it's absolutely beautiful. But that's a lot better than I remember it. That was rather fine.
Yes.
Rather fine.
What do you remember about that? Because he could be fun, and presumably he was quite fun with you guys behind the scenes.
Absolutely, it was great fun, and he liked to laugh, and he could take a laugh against himself. You know, this idea that Alec was always, bad tempered and all the rest of it. Of course, there were times when he got frustrated, but actually it was a good job. He was a hard taskmaster. He wouldn't have achieved what he achieved if he had not been a hard taskmaster. But once you get the work done, he unwound, and he was great company. He had a lot of good jokes, and he could take a joke against himself.
One person I was speaking to last night who used to work with him was telling me that during the 2015 election they were driving all over the place, and they were trying to work out, having a debate, what's the best day to die? Alex Salmond said it was a Saturday, because then you got all the Sunday papers if you were big enough. He was,
yes,
and he did.